In a tense confrontation aboard a flight, a MAGA hat-wearing woman stands her ground against a flight attendant enforcing company policy. What starts as a political disagreement turns into a larger conversation about respect, understanding, and freedom of expression. Watch as the story unfolds with an unexpected twist. The plane hummed as it ascended, cruising high above the clouds, a metal bird carving its way through the vast blue sky. Sarah Thompson, an ordinary woman with an extraordinary resolve, sat in her seat, gazing out of the window. She adjusted her red Make America Great Again hat, a symbol of her beliefs, her values, and the struggles she had faced over the years. The hat was a shield, a piece of armor she had worn proudly. But today, as she sat on this commercial flight, it would become the symbol of something much more profound, a moment that would challenge her patience, her tolerance, and ultimately, her dignity. It had been an uneventful morning when Sarah boarded the flight. She had been in the airport for hours, waiting for her delayed flight, just trying to make her way home after a visit to her sister. As usual, she wore her MAGA hat. It had become a signature of her identity, a way to express her political views and to stand firm in a divided world. The hat had seen her through heated debates, awkward dinner conversations, and much more. But today, it would be tested in a way she hadn't expected. As the passengers boarded, a subtle tension filled the air. People murmured in the aisles, shifting in their seats, and small talk echoed throughout the cabin. Sarah noticed a few odd glances as she made her way to her seat near the front of the plane. She was used to this kind of attention, but she couldn't help but feel an unease in the air. Something felt different this time. Settling into her seat, Sarah buckled her seatbelt, pulled out her book, and tried to distract herself from the subtle whispers. The flight attendants walked up and down the aisles, preparing for takeoff, making sure everyone was settled. Then Emily entered the cabin. Emily was young, eager, and energetic. She had been working as a flight attendant for about 2 years and took pride in her role as a guardian of peace, ensuring passengers felt comfortable and safe during their flight. She had worked hard to get where she was and had built a reputation for being efficient, friendly, and quick to enforce rules. However, Emily also had a strong sense of justice, one that leaned heavily toward inclusivity. She was passionate about creating a welcoming space, a space free from anything that could divide or cause discomfort. She had seen many passengers, many situations, but nothing like Sarah's MAGA hat. Emily didn't know it yet, but this would be the moment that tested her beliefs, her sense of duty, and her view of the world. As Emily passed by Sarah's row, she noticed the red hat immediately. It wasn't hard to miss. The bold white letters stood out in stark contrast against the blue and gray surroundings. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure why, but something about that hat made her feel uneasy. She didn't even know the woman sitting there. But the hat symbolized everything she disagreed with, everything she had worked against in her career as a flight attendant. It was hard to ignore the weight of what that hat represented in a world divided by political and ideological lines. Emily paused for a moment, looking at Sarah, then quickly turned her gaze away, hoping the moment would pass. She moved down the aisle, performing the routine duties of her job. But the nagging feeling didn't subside. Her hand lingered on the armrest of another passenger, and she felt the tightening in her chest. The hat was a symbol, but what did it represent? Was it harmless? Was it just a piece of clothing? Or did it have deeper implications for the people around her? As Emily made her way back toward Sarah, she knew she had to say something. The policy was clear. No visible political statements were allowed on the plane. The airline wanted to ensure a neutral and peaceful environment for everyone, and that policy had always been strictly enforced. But was this the right time to enforce it? Emily paused again, unsure of how to approach the situation. "Excuse me, Mom," Emily said, her voice firm, but attempting to be polite. "I'm going to need you to remove your hat." Sarah looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" "The hat," Emily repeated, her voice steady. "It's against our policy to wear political symbols on board. We ask that you remove it, please." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She had never been asked to remove the hat before. It was part of her identity, something she felt strongly about. She wasn't sure what to say at first. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner, and the sense of injustice began to build. How could she be asked to take it off? This was her right. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Why? Sarah asked, her voice tight. Why should I have to remove it? I'm just wearing a hat. Emily was taken aback by Sarah's response, but maintained her composure. It's a company policy. We don't allow any political statements on board. It's for the comfort of all our passengers. Sarah's jaw clenched. Comfort? You're saying that my hat is making people uncomfortable? That's not my problem. I have a right to wear this. Emily could see the anger in Sarah's eyes, but she remained calm. It's just a rule, Emily said, trying to keep things civil. If you don't remove it, I'll have to ask the captain to step in. Sarah's face flushed with frustration. This wasn't happening. She had been through so much in her life, fought for so long to stand by her beliefs, only to be asked to remove a symbol that meant so much to her. It wasn't just a hat, it was a part of who she was. She felt a wave of indignation wash over her. Fine, Sarah said, gripping her seat tightly. If you're going to escalate this, do it. But I'm not taking it off. Emily hesitated for a moment. She could see Sarah's resolve, but she also knew the rules. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford to bend the rules just because someone disagreed. Emily made a decision. She turned and walked to the front of the plane, signaling for the captain. As Sarah sat there, her heart racing, she felt the weight of the stares around her. People were watching. The tension in the air was palpable. She could hear whispers, feel eyes on her, and every passing second felt like a lifetime. She couldn't understand why something so simple, so personal, had escalated into such a confrontation. It was just a hat. In the front of the cabin, Emily was speaking with the captain. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but she could imagine the captain's stern response. Would he back Emily up? Would he understand Sarah's frustration? And why did this have to happen on a plane? The flight was supposed to be peaceful, a quiet escape from the chaos of the world. But now, it felt like a battlefield. The flight attendants at the front of the cabin watched the exchange from a distance. Some of them glanced over at Sarah, some of them at Emily. The cabin was divided, and Sarah felt the weight of that division as it pressed down on her. This wasn't just about a hat anymore. It was about respect, freedom, and the way people saw each other. How could something as simple as a hat become a symbol of division? How had it come to this? As Sarah's thoughts swirled, she waited. She didn't know what would happen next. But one thing was clear, this was only the beginning. Sarah's heart was pounding as she sat in her seat, her fingers clenching around the armrest. The conversation between Emily and the captain had left her feeling cold. She was used to confrontation news to people, questioning her beliefs, but this was different. There was something deeply personal about this moment. It wasn't just about the hat anymore. It was about who she was. It was about a symbol of her identity, her beliefs, and the fight she had put up for the rights she held dear. She had never expected something as simple as a hat to become a battleground. The cabin was unnervingly quiet. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing up occasionally as they waited for the next development. Some seemed sympathetic, while others were clearly annoyed by the disruption. Sarah felt the eyes on her, the whispers floating through the air, and the heat of judgment from strangers who didn't know her or understand what the hat meant. In her mind, Sarah was replaying the scene over and over. She had worn this hat countless times. It had never caused trouble before. In fact, it had often sparked debates, heated conversations, and even laughter. But today was different. Today, the hat had become a target for something much deeper than political division. It had become a symbol of everything that people feared, rejected, or misunderstood. As Emily returned to Sarah's row, Sarah could see the hesitation in her step. Emily's expression was neutral, but her eyes betrayed a hint of discomfort. She clearly didn't want to escalate the situation any further. But Sarah wasn't backing down. The flight attendants were usually trained to handle things diplomatically. But in Sarah's case, it felt like a personal attack. Emily had demanded something from her that went beyond just a simple rule. She had asked her to suppress a part of her identity. "Ma'am," Emily began, her voice steady but clearly strained. "I spoke with the captain. He's asked that you remove the hat. If you don't comply, we'll have to involve airport security once we land. Please understand, this isn't personal. It's just company policy." Sarah's face flushed with a mix of frustration and disbelief. It was hard for her to grasp the audacity of what was happening. She had been a loyal customer to this airline for years, flying with them countless times, never once questioning the policies in place. But now, here she was being told to remove a symbol of her political beliefs, a symbol that, to her, stood for the values of personal freedom, individual rights, and standing up for what you believe in. "I'm not taking it off," Sarah said firmly, her voice shaking slightly, but with a sense of resolve. "This hat means something to me. It's not just some accessory. It represents my beliefs, my choices. I don't care about the policy. I'm not going to remove it." Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She could feel the tension mounting. She wasn't just dealing with a difficult passenger. She was dealing with someone who was fighting for something much bigger than the current moment. The look in Sarah's eyes was one of defiance, and that defiance made Emily question everything. Was she wrong? Should she back down? But duty was duty, and she had a job to do. Emily glanced back at the captain, who was standing near the cockpit door, awaiting her decision. He looked stern, and she could feel the pressure mounting on her shoulders. As a flight attendant, she wasn't supposed to engage in ideological debates. She wasn't supposed to choose sides. But in this moment, it felt impossible to remain neutral. She was being asked to enforce a policy that was more about power than protection. She was enforcing a rule that divided people, rules that silenced beliefs and ideas that didn't fit into a singular box of acceptable norms. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Emily said quietly, "but I'm going to have to ask you again to remove the hat. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to have you escorted off the plane when we land." Sarah stood up, the words hitting her like a punch to the stomach. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, watching her every move. She could hear the whispers, the judgment that hung in the air like a thick fog. It wasn't just about the hat anymore. It was about what she represented, about the way others saw her, and the way the system was set up to silence people like her. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said with steely determination. "You can call security. You can call the police. You can do whatever you need to do. But I'm not taking off my hat. This is who I am, and no one can take that away from me." The words echoed in the cabin, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Emily was taken aback. She had expected a compliant response, or maybe even some resistance, but not this level of defiance. Sarah wasn't just standing her ground. She was standing for something much bigger than herself. Emily could see that. She could see the fire in Sarah's eyes, the strength behind the words. But she also saw a vulnerability. There was a hint of sadness in Sarah's eyes, something deeper than just the political debate at hand. The confrontation had reached a boiling point, and Sarah could feel the weight of the moment. She wasn't going to let herself be silenced. Not now, not ever. But at the same time, she felt the sharp sting of isolation. She had always known that wearing the hat would come with consequences, but she had never imagined it would lead to something like this. It wasn't just a simple disagreement, it was an attack on her identity. It was a reflection of the divisiveness that had seeped into every corner of society, into every public space, and now it had infiltrated the very plane she was sitting on. She glanced around, noticing the other passengers. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed indifferent, and a few were watching her with curiosity. She was the center of attention, and in that moment, she realized that she had become a symbol of something far bigger than herself. But was it a symbol of unity or division? Was she fighting for freedom, or was she perpetuating the very thing that had torn people apart? As the plane continued its journey, Sarah sat in silence, her mind racing. She felt the eyes of the world on her, and the weight of her beliefs pressing down on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for a hat. She was fighting for her right to exist in a world that seemed to want to silence her at every turn. She knew that once the plane landed, the confrontation would escalate. She didn't know how, but she knew it would. And in that moment, she steeled herself for whatever came next. The next few moments passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty. Would the captain intervene? Would the airline support Emily? And more importantly, would Sarah be forced to choose between her beliefs and her dignity? The air inside the cabin felt thick with tension, a weight so palpable it seemed to press down on every passenger. The moment of silence after, Sarah's defiant declaration hung in the air like an unresolved chord, vibrating with the discomfort of the situation. Emily stood rigid in the aisle, her gaze lingering on Sarah, unsure of how to proceed. She had hoped this would be resolved quickly and quietly, But now the situation felt much more complex. Sarah's unyielding stance had made it clear this wasn't just a personal issue. It was a political flashpoint. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah kept her eyes on Emily, her posture unshaken. Though her heart was racing, she could feel the eyes of other passengers on her, some sympathetic, others disapproving. She couldn't blame them. She had never anticipated that something as simple as wearing a hat could create so much tension. But here it was, all unfolding in real time. At 30,000 feet, she had hoped for a peaceful journey, but it seemed her beliefs were too controversial to escape notice. The hat had become a battleground, and she was unwilling to back down. Emily, for her part, didn't know what to do next. Her job was to ensure the comfort of all passengers, to maintain order and enforce the airline's policies. But this wasn't just about enforcing a policy, it was about personal convictions. She had seen firsthand the divisions within society, felt the sting of judgment from her peers when certain symbols were worn. In her mind, the hat was not merely a hat. It symbolized a divisiveness that had been tearing the fabric of her country apart. But standing in front of Sarah, she now questioned herself. Was this her fight to make? Was she right to press Sarah into submission, to try to silence what she stood for? Emily turned and walked briskly down the aisle, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. She needed to consult with the captain. There was no way this could be resolved between just the two of them. Not with so many eyes on them. Not with the passengers' varying opinions now swirling. She needed authority. She needed backup. Sarah watched Emily disappear toward the front of the plane, the sense of uncertainty growing in her chest. She didn't want to escalate this further, but she couldn't see another way forward. She had become the very thing she despised in others, the victim of unjust judgment based solely on a symbol that carried so much weight. As the seconds stretched into minutes, she began to reflect on the larger implications of the confrontation. What would happen if she were forced off the plane? Would she be labeled a troublemaker for something so trivial as a hat? Was her refusal to take it off a rebellion worth fighting for? The quiet hum of the airplane was interrupted by the soft murmur of passengers, exchanging hushed whispers. Some were sympathetic, nodding in silent approval at Sarah's defiance, while others seemed uncomfortable, glancing at their neighbors in awkward silence. One woman, seated across the aisle, leaned forward and gave Sarah an apologetic look. "I'm really sorry you're going through this," she whispered. "I don't agree with what's happening either." Sarah nodded, grateful for the support, even if it was quiet and understated. Her gaze flicked toward the front of the plane, where Emily was now speaking to the captain. Sarah could hear snippets of their conversation. Although the details were lost on her, all she knew was that this moment would shape her journey far more than she had anticipated. She thought back to the moment she had stepped onto the plane, unaware that something as simple as a red MAGA hat would lead to a scene like this. She had chosen the hat out of routine, out of habit. It had become a part of her, an outward symbol of everything she believed in. But now it had come to represent something far bigger. It was a marker of political division, a symbol of an era that seemed to be fracturing before her eyes. A few minutes later, Emily returned, accompanied by the captain. There was a sense of authority in the way the captain carried himself. He was tall, with graying hair, his uniform perfectly crisp. But his eyes, when they met Sarah's, were not cold or distant. They were filled with a calm kind of empathy, a quiet understanding. Still, he had a job to do. "Ma'am," the captain said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I'm Captain Harris. I've been informed of the situation. I must ask you to remove your hat as it goes against our policy on political statements." Sarah sat up straighter in her seat, meeting his gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, Captain, this isn't just a hat to me. It's my right to express my beliefs, and I'm not removing it. I'm not causing any harm." The captain paused for a moment, taking in her words. Sarah could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't unsympathetic, but he was also caught in a policy that he had to uphold. "I understand your position, ma'am," Captain Harris said, his voice softening slightly. "But I also have a responsibility to ensure the comfort of all our passengers and to enforce the rules. The policy is clear." Sarah's hands gripped the armrests as she held her ground. "I understand your responsibility, but I'm not violating anyone's rights by wearing a hat. I'm not being disruptive. I'm just expressing myself. The captain let out a deep sigh, glancing at Emily, who was standing nearby, her expression one of frustration and concern. There was an underlying tension in the air, a quiet understanding that this was no longer just about policy. This was about something deeper. You're right, ma'am, the captain said slowly. I'll give you that. However, we need to reach a resolution here. If you're not willing to remove the hat, I'll have no choice but to escalate the situation. We can't allow disruptions that could affect the flight. Emily, standing to the side, seemed to fidget uncomfortably. It was clear that she didn't want to push the situation further, but she had already made her decision. The policy was the policy, and in her mind, there was no room for exceptions. Sarah's resolve didn't waver. You can escalate it all you want, she said, her voice calm but firm. But I'm not removing it. If I'm forced off this plane, then so be it. I'll take the consequences. The captain's eyes softened as he looked at her, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw a flicker of empathy in his expression. He knew that this was not just about a hat. It was about something much bigger, the right to speak freely, to be yourself in the face of opposition. Please don't make this harder than it has to be, the captain said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. We don't want to escalate this any further. But if you refuse, we will have to take further action. I don't want this to end badly for either of us. Sarah looked around at the other passengers, her heart racing. The eyes of the cabin were on her. This was no longer just a disagreement. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. A moment where a simple act of self-expression became a source of division. I'm not backing down, she said, her voice resolute. I'm not going to be silenced. This is who I am, and I refuse to be made to feel ashamed of that. Captain Harris nodded, his face resigned. He turned to Emily, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, her eyes avoiding Sarah's. Please make a note of this. The captain said quietly, we may need to take action when we land. As Emily made her way back down the aisle, Sarah leaned back in her seat, her mind swirling with thoughts of defiance, resolve, and uncertainty. She had made a stand today, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced. She had made her point, and now she could only wait and see what would happen next. The rest of the flight was quiet, save for the hum of the engines and the occasional shuffle of passengers. No one said much more. It was as if the entire cabin was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. For Sarah, the flight had become a metaphor for everything she had been through in her life, a journey filled with uncertainty, conflict, and the hope that, in the end, the truth would rise above the noise. The hum of the airplane engines continued to resonate through the cabin as Sarah sat, tense and still, her back pressed against the seat. The events of the past hour felt like a blur, an escalation that she had never anticipated when she first boarded the flight. She had worn her MAGA hat countless times without incident, and it was always just that, a symbol of her beliefs, something that represented who she was. Today, it had become the flashpoint of a much larger issue, one that was pushing her to the edge. Sarah glanced around the cabin, her eyes catching the occasional sympathetic gaze from a few fellow passengers. But most seemed to avoid looking at her directly. The discomfort in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut through. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but there was also a strange sense of solidarity from some who had witnessed the entire ordeal. She had become a symbol of defiance to them, but that didn't make the situation any easier. She still felt like an outsider on her own flight, a passenger who had been singled out and judged for nothing more than a red hat. Emily had returned to her station, no doubt still stewing over the uncomfortable situation that had unfolded. She had a job to do, a duty to follow the airline's policies. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she had to question herself. Was she right to ask Sarah to remove the hat? Was it worth causing this level of conflict over something so trivial? She had always been proud of upholding the rules, but this time the rules felt inadequate. She was certain that the passengers were aware of the tension and the underlying issue. The conflict was now larger than just Sarah's hat. Captain Harris, meanwhile, had returned to the cockpit after the conversation, clearly still processing the situation. Sarah knew that he wasn't a villain in this story, but his role had been one of authority, one that had required him to uphold the airline's policies, even though they felt wrong in this case. They were both caught in a dilemma. navigating through the storm of personal beliefs, company rules, and public judgment. They had been forced into a position they didn't want to be in. As Sarah sat in her seat, her mind drifted to the bigger picture. She thought about the state of the country, the political climate that seemed to be growing more divisive by the day. She had always been an advocate for freedom of expression, even when it meant challenging the status quo. Her hat was more than just a political statement. It was her right to wear it, her right to speak out, and her right to be seen and heard in a world that often tried to silence people who didn't conform. But in this confined space, at this moment, it wasn't just about the hat. It wasn't just about politics. It was about the deep-seated fear people had of each other's differences. It was about how the smallest act of self-expression could lead to such tension, such division. And as she sat there, staring out the window, she couldn't help but feel the weight of that reality on her shoulders. After what felt like an eternity, Emily reappeared in the aisle, walking briskly toward Sarah's seat. She was holding a small, folded piece of paper, which she handed to the captain before turning back to face Sarah. Her expression was different now, softer, more hesitant, as if the tension had finally broken through the walls of formality she had built around herself. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for what's happened," Emily said, her voice much quieter than before. "I think I may have overstepped, and I just want to make things right." Sarah looked at Emily, a mixture of relief and wariness flooding her chest. She could feel the sincerity in the air between them. Emily's words weren't just an apology for the confrontation. They were a realization, a recognition of the pain caused by such a simple act. The apology was not just for Sarah's sake. It was for Emily's own sense of discomfort, for realizing that in this moment, the rules were far more divisive than they had ever been intended to be. "I appreciate that," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "I know you were just doing your job. But this isn't about a hat. It's about a deeper issue, the way people treat each other, the way we judge one another for the simplest things. And it's not just me. It's everyone who's ever felt marginalized because they don't fit into someone else's idea of what's acceptable." Emily nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I understand," she said quietly. "It's just that sometimes the rules don't feel like they leave room for you has to really see people for who they are." Sarah nodded in return. "Exactly. It's so easy to judge, to put people into categories based on something they wear or say. But that doesn't tell you who they are or what they stand for. It doesn't show the whole picture." For a brief moment, there was a shared silence between them, one of understanding. Emily, who had initially felt so justified in enforcing the policy, now found herself questioning the very rules she had always relied on. Sarah, on the other hand, was beginning to heard something she hadn't expected when she boarded the plane that morning. She had expected to face the usual judgment, the usual resistance to her political beliefs. But in this moment, with Emily's apology and the captain's quiet acknowledgement, she felt like she had made her point, and it was resonating with more than just the passengers who had judged her. Suddenly, the cabin's intercom crackled to life, the captain's voice filling the space. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a warmth that had been absent before. "I want to take a moment to thank you for your patience. We're nearly halfway through our flight, and I know there's been some tension in the cabin. I just want to remind everyone that this is a space for all people, regardless of their beliefs or what they wear. We all deserve respect and understanding." The words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. The captain was addressing the elephant in the room, something that hadn't been done since the moment this confrontation had started. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about acknowledging that there was a shared humanity in the cabin that should be respected, no matter the differences in belief. When the captain's voice faded from the intercom, the hum of the plane seemed to soften, the atmosphere in the cabin shifting. There was still tension, but it was no longer hostile. People were beginning to relax, and a few began to engage in small conversations again, some with Sarah, some among themselves. The collective discomfort had been addressed, and while the issue wasn't fully resolved, there was a sense of closure in the air. Sarah turned to look at Emily once more, her expression softer than before. "Thank you," she said. "You didn't have to say all of that, but it means a lot." Emily smiled, her gaze steady. "No, thank you for reminding me that sometimes we need to listen more than we talk." As the flight continued, Sarah leaned back in her seat, her thoughts swirling but feeling lighter. She wasn't naive. She knew that the world wasn't going to change because of a single interaction on a plane. But there was something to be said for the power of dialogue, for the power of standing up for yourself, even when the world tells you to be quiet. And maybe, just maybe, the world would start to listen. The journey wasn't over, but in that moment, Sarah realized that perhaps the most important steps weren't the ones taken on the ground, but the ones taken in the quiet of a flight. Amid the turbulence of disagreement and the rising hope for understanding, the rest of the flight passed in a much quieter atmosphere. Sarah, though she had felt shaken earlier by the confrontation, now felt a strange sense of calm. The tension that had filled the cabin had dissipated, replaced by a newfound respect. The small talk among passengers resumed, and some even smiled at Sarah as they passed, acknowledging her quiet but firm defiance. It wasn't the resolution she had expected, but it was one she could live with. The captain's public announcement had broken the silence in the cabin, and for a brief moment, everyone seemed to settle. It wasn't just about the hat anymore. It was about acknowledging each other's presence, respecting each other's space, and understanding that, at the end of the day, we're all human no matter the political affiliations or opinions we hold. As the flight neared its destination, Sarah felt the weight in her chest lighten. She glanced out the window, watching the clouds pass by. There was something about flying, something about the vast expanse of sky, that made the world seem a little bit smaller, as if, from above, it was easier to see that what divided people was not nearly as important as what united them. Sarah thought about the conversation with Emily earlier. The flight attendant had apologized, and that apology had meant more than Sarah had anticipated. It wasn't just an apology for the hat. It was an apology for the system that had made them both participants in this conflict. It was an apology for the way she had let her own biases influence her actions, without considering the bigger picture. It wasn't lost on Sarah that Emily's self-reflection had come at a personal cost. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that her actions were justified. But the apology given with humility had taken courage. Emily had shared with Sarah that she hadn't wanted to cause trouble but had been following company protocol. Sarah understood. It was the system, the rules, that had created this divide, not the individuals themselves. But as she thought about it, Sarah realized that rules were only as good as the people who enforced them. Rules were necessary, but so was compassion. The airline had policies in place, but sometimes those policies could only be as effective as the understanding and empathy behind them. And then there was the captain. He had stepped in when the situation seemed like it might spiral out of control. His words over the intercom had been more than just a reminder of the company's values. They had been an acknowledgement of the discomfort. Everyone in the cabin was feeling the unspoken tension that, until that point, had been ignored. The captain's intervention had been a subtle act of leadership, reminding everyone that differences of opinion could coexist. But that respect and understanding should always come first. As the plane descended toward its destination, Sarah felt a sense of empowerment that she hadn't anticipated. This flight, which had started with her trying to mind her own business and enjoy a peaceful journey, had turned into something much more. It had turned into a personal journey, not just one of physical distance, but one of growth. She had stood up for herself in a way that felt true to her values. But more importantly, she had witnessed growth in the people around her. Emily had learned something important about herself and her role in the world. The captain had offered a moment of humanity, in a moment that could have easily been defined by rigid policy. And the passengers, as they left the plane, left with a reminder of what it meant to respect each other. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Sarah felt her grip on the armrest loosen. The anxiety she had felt earlier was gone, replaced with a strange sense of satisfaction. She hadn't won a victory in the way most people would see it. She hadn't changed anyone's mind or swayed an opinion, but she had won something far more important. She had remained true to herself, and in doing so, she had created a small ripple of change. The flight, the confrontation, had sparked something in the passengers and crew alike. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about respect, about the power of standing up for yourself, and the courage to look beyond surface differences. As she stood up to retrieve her carry-on from the overhead compartment, Sarah caught Emily's eye. Emily was still at the front of the plane, her expression softer than it had been when she had first confronted Sarah. As passengers began to file off the plane, Emily approached Sarah with a tentative smile. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice quiet, "for being patient with me. I didn't realize how much of this was about something bigger than just a policy. You've made me see things differently." Sarah smiled, nodding. "Thank you for listening. Sometimes we just need to see the bigger picture. It's easy to get caught up in rules, but we can't forget to treat each other like people." Emily's smile deepened, and she extended her hand. "I'll remember that," she said, "and I'll do better next time." Sarah shook her hand firmly, grateful for the exchange. It wasn't just about the hat anymore. It was about the understanding they had shared in the aftermath of the confrontation. They were two people from different walks of life, brought together by a seemingly small disagreement over something that had grown into a much larger issue. But in that moment, they had both taken a step toward understanding, and that was enough. As Sarah walked off the plane and into the terminal, she felt a sense of lightness in her step. She was more than just the political beliefs associated with her hat. She was a person with her own values, and she had every right to express those beliefs without fear of judgment. But she also realized that she had a responsibility to approach others with empathy and understanding, just as she hoped others would do for her. It was a two-way street. Standing up for your beliefs was important, but it was just as important to listen, to try to understand, and to acknowledge the humanity of others. As she walked through the airport toward baggage claim, Sarah's thoughts were clear. She had come out of this experience with a stronger sense of herself and a better understanding of how to navigate a world filled with division. She had seen firsthand the impact of empathy, the power of standing firm without becoming rigid, and the importance of connecting with others, even when differences seemed insurmountable. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was only the beginning. She knew there would be more challenges, more moments where she would have to stand up for what she believed in. But now, she was ready. She had seen the difference one conversation could make. She had experienced the power of confronting discomfort head-on. And, most importantly, she had learned that understanding wasn't just about finding common ground. It was about meeting people where they were, respecting their humanity, and seeing them as more than just the labels they wore. As she picked up her luggage and walked toward the exit, Sarah felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The world was complicated, and the divides seemed wide. But she had taken a small step toward bridging that gap. And for now, that was enough.